Welcome to Truth for Life. I'm Bob Lepine. We are doing things a little differently today. We have the opportunity to have a conversation with Alistair Begg about a book that has recently been revised and updated, a book he wrote called Made for His Pleasure, 10 Benchmarks of a Vital Faith. Alistair, thanks for joining us. I have to tell you, I read the title of your book, and what was ringing in my ears was the answer to the first question, what is the chief end of man? That's really at the heart of why you wrote this book, isn't it?
Yes, it is. How perceptive are you? Yeah, and I think it was that and the sort of element that went along with that because of the vintage in relationship to Chariots of Fire. You know, when I run, I feel His pleasure.
Well, when you look at this subject today, I think a lot of Christians know the right answer, that we are made for His pleasure, and yet we live day in and day out as if we're made for something else, don't we?
Yes, it's the great temptation. I mean, it's Luther, isn't it, that we are by nature, all of us, curved in upon ourselves. We tend, whether we like it or not, to be thinking, how does this go for me? You know, where do I fit in this? And it is a radical shift when we begin to think in terms of the glory of God and the pleasure that He takes in our obedience to Him and our love for His Son.
When we know what we're made for, it changes how we live out our lives every day. And if we can keep that focus, that we are made for something other than just our enjoyment of life, it affects the choices we make in every aspect of life.
Yes, you know, and even just first of all, understanding that we were made, apart from the pleasure part, you know, that so many people are going through life with no notion of a creator God who fashioned them purposefully and who sustains their lives by His providence. And that's the starting point. And then when we realize that the God who did that is a God who has loved us so much in Jesus that He is designed us in such a way that we can live to the maximum as we understand what it means to live for His glory.
When I looked at the table of contents, at first I thought, well, this is going to be a book about spiritual disciplines, and that's part of what you're touching on, but that's not the whole of this book, is it?
No, it's not really. You know, the genesis of the book was in giving an impromptu address one day where I'd had very little preparation time, and I was thrust in on the situation, and I came up with these things essentially on the back of an envelope as an outline. And subsequent to that, I think somebody else suggested to me that it wasn't a bad outline if we were able to flesh it out. So it started out as a talk to college students that then morphed into this.
Well, and what I love about it is it's really rich with pastoral wisdom. This is you talking about what you've experienced in your own walk with Jesus, what you've led others to experience. It's rooted in Scripture, but it's not really an exegetical journey we're on, as it is a practical outliving of our faith.
It's probably the most biographical thing I've ever done, and in that sense, it's a little bit alarming to reread it. But I hope that where my own personal journey bleeds into it, it helps to set forward things rather than proves to be a distraction to them.
Well, and I want to ask you about the biographical nature of this, especially around one of the themes you deal with, and that's the subject of prayer. I've never met a Christian who, when the subject of prayer comes up, the person says, oh, this is one of those areas I've got pretty well under control. I'm handling this pretty well in my walk with Jesus. I think we all feel like we are not doing well in our prayer lives. We know it's vital, and yet we feel like we're lacking in that regard. How have you wrestled with that personally?
Well, you know, I had the great benefit of having praying parents, so that I knew that you could do this or you should do this. I mean, I actually have a fairly vivid recollection of being in my bedroom and waking up after I'd gone to sleep and hearing conversation, but as I listened to it, it didn't sound like it was a conversation between two people. And then I realized, as I listened more carefully, that it was my father, and he was praying before he went to bed, and he was, he's praying audibly. And so I both learned the notion of prayer by observation, And then a couple of points along the journey, we had encounters that could clearly be seen just really as answers to prayer, which helped. But when it came to translating it into one's own framework, yeah, that's when the real struggle starts, because especially if you are put together as an activist at all, you tend to think, well, let's get the prayer thing over with as fast as we can so we can get down to the real issue. And it takes time, and it's a hard lesson, and it's a consistent lesson, though, to realize that, as we sometimes say, prayer is the work. We don't pray for the work. And the more you think about that, the more you realize why it is that Paul, at the end of Ephesians 6, is urging upon his readers supplication for all the saints and prayer for himself, and that immediately on the heels of all that he said about the importance of the armor of God and wrestling against the evil one. And the people who have written classically on prayer have, I think, always seen it as a real area of spiritual battle.
So if I had known you 20 years ago and knew you today, would your prayer life be different today than it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think it would be different in that, as I've learned how demanding it is, I've reached out for various ways to try and help myself. I get tired of my own voice, if you like, not least of all in public prayer, which is really daunting, but also in one's own private prayer life. And that's where, a diary of private prayer by Bailey has been a help to me. The Valley of Vision has been a help, I think, to many of us. The Anglican Prayer Book, for all of its formality, nevertheless, it helps me. And sometimes in the morning, I just do the morning service of prayer. There's nobody there except me, but it lets me pretend to be an Anglican for about 20 minutes.
We are breaking from our normal pattern here on Truth for Life to have a conversation today with Alistair Begg about his book, Made for His Pleasure. This is a book that has recently been revised and updated, and before we're done, we'll let you know how you can get a copy of Alistair's book. As I looked through the themes that you address in the book, Made for His Pleasure, and thought to myself, which of these themes is most urgent in our day? It's hard to pick one, but the issue of holiness stood out to me as something that seems to be missing from the contemporary walk of faith for many Christians.
Yes, I think that's very accurate, isn't it? I remember some years ago going to a very well-known college in the United States and rhetorically at first asking how many of you have read J.C. Ryle's Holiness? And there wasn't even a response, Mm-hmm. And then I said, how many of you have actually ever heard of J.C. Ryle? And there wasn't any response. And then somewhat naughtily I said, how many of you, if any of you, have ever heard of holiness? And I don't think I was back there very often. But no, I think, it is a real issue, isn't it? That without holiness, there's no heaven. And that the reason that we have been redeemed is in order that we might be conformed to the image of Jesus. Part of it, I think, has to do with the way in which holiness has been offered to us in many ways, clothed in a certain, almost in my background, a sort of Victorian framework that seems distinctly unattractive to any boy. The whole notion of sanctification and the interplay between justification and sanctification is under attack from all kinds of quarters, and therefore we're desperately in need of a biblical understanding of what we mean when we begin to talk about the issue of holiness.
Well, and I think a lot of people look at the subject of holiness and they mistake either self-righteousness or a series of traditional dictums and rules as biblical holiness. We really have to understand what God means when he calls us to holiness, not what the church has taught us necessarily, right?
Yes, I think so. The way it is framed really is very, very important. And the scriptures are clear. Sometimes we are a little dim on the uptake.
I was a little surprised that there's a chapter on marriage in a book about being made for his pleasure.
Well, how could we ever understand pleasure without marriage? I mean, it's hard. It's not impossible, but This is the great mystery. He says, I'm talking about Christ and the church. And, even the single person looks on to marriage and realizes that this is there in part in order to point us away and beyond marriage. So that even Paul's instruction on marriage in Ephesians is not written just so that people who are married can understand how to be married, but it is in order that all of us might understand the nature of God's purpose for his world.
You compare the early years of marriage to an airplane ride. Were the early years of your marriage bumpy?
No, I think I was the exhilarating takeoff to which I was referring. It started off going pretty quickly, and then it smooths out, and then it bumps. And I used to say to people, if you make it through the first year, you'll be fine. Now I'm saying, if you can make it through the first 7, you should be okay. But no, I think it's a simple treatment in the book, but hopefully it's helpful at least.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about how important humility is in our walk with Christ, and I think if there's I hate to even think of it as kind of the sine qua non of what the Christian life is, but if pride is our besetting sin, then humility is our cardinal virtue, isn't it?
Yes, it's hard to escape the fact that when we're introduced to the servant of the Lord, he doesn't cry aloud in the streets. He doesn't shout over people. He doesn't talk down to people. He introduces himself as he who is gentle and lowly in heart. And when we are being conformed to his image, then at least we ought to be making at least baby steps along that journey. But our whole world, our whole contemporary culture is so focused on self-aggrandizement and self-assertion and just basically self, that it really rubs people up the wrong way when we come up against what the Bible has to say concerning these things. Don't let the wise man boast in his wisdom or the strong man boast in his strength, Well, isn't that what we're supposed to do when we write our resumes, to tell everybody how super we are? Now, the other side of it, of course, is that there's an approach to humility that is really essentially very proud, in that, Augustine said, there's something about humility that appeals to my ego, that kind of thing. But it's just about, isn't it, real? It's the decentralization of ourselves and the acknowledgement of, all that we are and all that we have is from him. Who are you? What do you have you did not receive? 1 Corinthians 4, Romans 11, for from him and through him and to him are all things. But I just I need every day of my life to be reorienting myself around those truths, because pride is constantly there, it's just grabbing for you all the time. I mean, we don't want to live entirely, exclusively in Romans 7, but we certainly have to acknowledge that we do live both in 7 and in 8, that there is no condemnation, but is quite remarkable, because what a wretched man I am.
Let me remind our listeners that we are having a conversation today with Alistair Begg about a book that he's written called Made for His Pleasure. This is a book that has recently been revised and updated, and we will let you know before we're done today how you can get a copy of this book. You use a metaphor in the book of a physical checkup. I had the sense that maybe you had been through one recently when you wrote this chapter, and you talk about doing a spiritual checkup on ourselves and being able to have a sense of our heart, our lungs, our strength. If you were doing a diagnosis of Christians in our day, evangelical Christians in 21st century America, what kind of a spiritual checkup do you think we would get?
Wow, that's a tough one, isn't it? If I think of my own self, I think you think of words like flabby, lazy, fearful, anxious, without reason. And then on the negative side,
now that we've talked about all the good things,
putting the pluses aside for a moment, the thing is, it's Robert Burns who says, would to God the gift be us to see ourselves as others see us. When you go for a checkup, it's the ability of the other person, because of their training, to, prod at a certain place and touch. And I think perhaps the great danger is that people either live with a sense that I'm really doing very, very well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Or I'm doing so miserably, I'm absolutely useless. Because it would seem to me that part of the spiritual battle where the schemes of the devil are at work, he's happy to neutralize the believer on either of those two fronts.
Right.
And again, temperament comes into play in relationship to that. So he knows, someone who's tremendously egotistical, he's going to have to work very, very hard to get him to admit that he is a worm. Yeah. But the person who is sort of disposed in that way, then often their spiritual health suffers as a result of succumbing to the temptation to believe that somehow or another my strength is in myself, rather than realizing that my very weakness is a key to my discovery of strength in Christ alone.
They take themselves out of the spiritual ball game because they don't feel they can contribute anything. But God calls us to faithfulness and says, in your weakness, my power will be made perfect, right?
Absolutely. And in certain cases, Paul has to be shown his weakness. It has to be brought into a situation where he finally realizes, wow, okay, then when I am weak, then I am strong. I would think that Paul, I don't think, would have had much of a problem with low self-esteem. Right. Even in Christ. I don't mean that he was proud, but I think it's not difficult to imagine that he is making a real journey of his own discovery in relationship to that. And you cite in the book, when you talk about this issue of spiritual flabbiness, you cite Paul's words where he says, I buffet my body, I box, I fight, I press. Being made for his pleasure doesn't mean we just sit back in an easy chair and go, well, we can coast this one out, does it? No, again, now we're back really at the holiness question, aren't we? I mean, where do these kind of thoughts of curbing myself and taking myself under control come into play? For example, I love reading novels, and there's nothing I don't read bad novels. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with the material I'm reading. But that can become a real snare for me because I just like reading them so much. I could read them rather than read my Bible. I could read them rather than study. I could read them rather than talk to my wife. I could just quite happy to sit in a corner and read. Well, you say, well, that's not exactly what you call a major spiritual battle, is it? Well, in the sense that it can easily become an idol or whatever it is. And so saying to myself, well, no, I must lay this down. And I must put this aside or whatever it might be. And that's in a very small way, but it's an indication of just getting things within the framework of spiritual control, if you like.
You point to the discipline of evangelism as one of the ways that we reflect the fact that we are made for his pleasure. What's your sense of how we are doing in our generation in that area?
Well, it depends where we go. I was with somebody the other day, and I was being reminded again of the straightforward simplicity of being prepared to essentially say, I've actually become a follower of Jesus Christ, and I don't know if you've ever even thought about that. And the person may say, no, I haven't, and I never want to. But they may also say, no, please tell me about that. In fact, I was playing golf the other day with a fellow who had been playing handball or racquetball with somebody, and they'd taken a pause in between games, and the fellow said to him, he said, how are you? And he said, well, I think I'm good. And his friend said to him, I'm not sure you are good. And he said, oh, really? He said, why not? And then he said, has anyone ever told you about the love of God for you? And he said, no. He said, do you mind if I do? And he said, no. And right there sitting on the floor in between games on a racquetball court, this fellow led this fellow to Christ. And wow. I played golf with him the other day. He's a vibrant Christian. But it came about as a result of a throwaway line where the person was brave enough to break the pain barrier, if you like, with his friend. I find that very challenging and wonderfully refreshing. And I think that in the sort of public arena of things, some of us in pastoral ministry are in danger of suggesting to our congregations that they have done evangelism if they've invited anyone to church, when all they've actually done is invite people into a building. That's not evangelism. And so it's a far more exciting and a far more encouraging and a far more effective way for them to realize that both by life and by lip, they can engage in that way. And to your question about how we're doing today, I look back to the early 70s and Campus Crusade and everything that was going on then when I was in my, late teens and early 20s. And then I think about, Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel. I think there's a danger that we're getting a little bit like a marina here for pleasure sailing rather than a lifeboat station.
I've sensed the same thing and sensed it in my own in my own walk with Christ, and God's been challenging me. How can you take more bold steps rather than just inviting people to church?
Right.
And I think your chapter in this book is helpful to rekindle some of that passion for us. So I'm grateful for that. As you look at your hope and your prayer for how God will use this book in the lives of readers, what is it that you hope will be accomplished?
Well, I think the people that have helped me most in my Christian life have seemed to be individuals who had their feet planted on the ground. They clearly loved Jesus and they wanted to follow him. And when they gave expression to that, they did so in a way that didn't make me go, oh, I don't think I could ever do that, but actually made me say, oh, well, I think I can make a stab at that. And that's really what I hope in a book like this, when they work their way through it and they realize that from chapter to chapter, it's not addressing things that are way out there, but it's immediate, it's practical, and yet hopefully it's gospel-centered and it's Christ-focused in such a way that people say, well, God helping me, I think I can make progress in this regard, and I too can live for his pleasure.
Well, I think, speaking for our listeners, this has been helpful. I know it's been helpful for me to be able to talk with you about your book, Made for His Pleasure. You're listening to Alistair Begg on a special edition of Truth for Life. And the book we've been talking about is Alistair's revised and updated book, Made for His Pleasure, 10 Benchmarks of a Vital Faith. We'd love to put a copy of this book in your hands today. It's our way of expressing our thanks when you give a gift or join the team of faithful monthly Truth Partners who make this ministry possible. In fact, as you listen to Truth for Life and benefit from the in-depth Bible teaching you hear each day, you have our Truth Partners to thank. Truth Partners are the ones who give monthly so that all of us can learn from these daily messages in the same way they have. Being a Truth Partner is a personal mission. As you join the team, you help bring the gospel to men and women in all kinds of life circumstances, including men like Joe, who wrote to us recently, and his letter is read by Bob, who is part of our Truth for Life team.
I'm an inmate who listens to Truth for Life daily in Houston. Thanks for your ministry and the impact it's had on my life and is having on the lives of many more.
Well, again, if you're already a Truth Partner, thank you. And if you've been listening to Truth for Life and have grown in your understanding of God's Word as a result of the teaching you hear, would you become a Truth Partner? You can do it right now by calling 888-588-7884 or sign up online at truthforlife.org. When you do, remember to ask for your copy of the book Made for His Pleasure by Alistair Begg. I'm Bob Lepine, hoping you'll join us again tomorrow as we begin a new series called Encore 2018. We'll be revisiting some of the most popular messages from the past 12 months. This daily program featuring the Bible teaching of Alistair Begg is furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.